I welcome you in this demo class. In this class, we are going to discuss very briefly the structural changes which have taken place in India's economy ever since it has started its journey of development since 1950-51. The structural change basically means the structure of broad economic sectors, that is agriculture, manufacturing, and services, in terms of their share in the GDP and employment of the country. Various economists like Colin Clark, Irving Fisher, Simon Kuznets, Chenery in the last century, and most recently Timmers, etc., they have observed a pattern of structural transformation of all the economies who have started their development process over a period of time. And they observed that the two simultaneous phenomenon takes place in the economy. One is a structural shift in terms of contribution of the three main sectors, favoring the non-farm sectors, and total employment in the economy shift away from agriculture towards the other two main sectors, first towards industry, followed by the services. The sequence of structural change as observed by these economists empirically in various economies, and they found that the falling share of agriculture, which was at first offset by a rising industrial sector in the early stages of development, and thereafter service sector took over the lead, and only after a fairly high level of development, the service sector started contributing more towards GDP as well as in employment after a period of time. And therefore, the sequence is observed in almost most of the economies. But when we look at the India's economy, we find a, a, a different kind of structural change which has taken place over a period of time. If first you look at the graph, this graph indicates that over a period of time, the share of agriculture, which is shown by blue, is declining in GDP, while the share of services have increased over a period of time. But the share of industry and manufacturing, which is shown by pink color in between, is almost remain unchanged. Not much change has occurred in this sector. But when we break up this period into two periods, we find that in 1950, the share of agriculture in GDP was 52%, while the industrial manufacturing was having 18% share and services were having 30% share in the GDP. But in the next 30 years, if you look at that, agriculture share has declined by 17 percentage point from 52 to 35, and industry and manufacturing share has increased by 10 percentage point, and the services sector has increased only by 7 percentage point. It means in the first 30 years of the development journey, industry and manufacturing grew faster, and their share has increased by 10 percentage point vis-a-vis the 7 percentage point increase in services sector. And the major factor of rising industry and manufacturing was the development strategy we adopted from second five-year plan onwards, wherein the focus was on the industrialization based strategy, in which we have focused on the development of heavy industries like capital goods industries, basic industries in the economy, which have raised the share of industrial manufacturing to the 28% from 18% in the beginning. But if you look at the next 40 years, in the next 40 years, if you look at the agriculture share has further declined by 19 percentage point. It has reduced from 35% in 50-80 to 16% during this period. 16%. And industry and manufacturing share has almost remained stagnant, rather it has declined. it has declined from 28% to 23%. 5% decline was observed, while the share of services sector have increased by 24 percentage point. Therefore, in the later part of the development journey, starting from 1980 till today, the service sector has taken the lead, and service sector has contributed around the 60% of the GDP. The share of agriculture has declined significantly from 52% in the beginning to 16% today. But the share of industry and manufacturing remain almost stable or stagnant during this period. During this period, as I said that in the beginning, the increased share of industry and manufacturing was on account of the import substituting industrialization based strategy we adopted. But in first 30 years, the share has increased, and even after the economic reforms, new economic policy we adopted, the initially increased. Share has initially increased, and it increased to around 17% between 2004 and 2012, as far as manufacturing is concerned. But thereafter, it has declined, and the main reason for decline was the demonetization and the introduction of the GST, which has adversely impacted the performance of MSME manufacturing sector. As a result, the share of manufacturing in the GDP has declined from 17% to 13-14%, and it has remained at this level since then. It has remained at this level since then. You see that share of manufacturing in the GDP has been remained almost stagnant right from the 1960 till 21. In 60 it was 14.5%, and in 21 it is again remained at around 14%. And therefore the stagnation of share of the manufacturing sector in GDP is the major cause of stagnation of industry and manufacturing in the GDP. Despite the fact that the manufacturing has a high employment elasticity, despite the fact that it has high employment elasticity, it has not performed well as far as their share in the GDP is concerned. And therefore, the peculiar type of pattern has emerged, wherein the services sector picked up fast, and their share in the GDP has increased. Their share of services sector in GDP has increased over a period of time, particularly after the new economic policy was announced in 1991. But after the service share has increased, the different views have come forward. One view says that the increasing share of services in the GDP is a temporary phenomenon, and the growth rate will be unsustainable in the long run if it keeps relying on the growth of the services sector. While a different view is presented, wherein it has been proved that the even services sector can lead the growth process in the economy. But we have to reconcile these two views, and the reconciliation has been done by the changing in the composition of the service sector itself. In the first phase of development, the traditional services like retail trade, hotels, restaurant, transport, storage were important, and they were expanding, and their share in GDP was rising. But after the economic reforms in 1991, the modern services have taken the lead, particularly the telecommunications, the information technology enabled services, and the business services like the financial services, insurance services. They have taken the lead, and these are the organized services and more capital intensive, more knowledge intensive services. And they have when they expanded, the contribution of service sector in GDP has increased significantly, and therefore these modern services are considered to be the engine of growth in the India's economy. And therefore, in today the India's growth is led by the service sector. Given this change in the composition of GDP, the question arises whether the commensurate changes have taken place in the workforce, in the employment of the workforce in various sectors. And when we look at the employment of the workforce in various sectors, we find that look at this graph. This indicates that the at the in 1970s the agriculture was employing around 74% of the workforce, while the industry and manufacturing were employing only 11%, and services were employing 15% in 70s. But in 2020, you see that the share of agriculture has declined from 74 to 44%, and the share of industry and manufacturing has increased from 11% to 25%, while the share of services have increased only 15%, from 15% to 31% during this period, despite the fact that the share of services sector in GDP has increased from the 30% to 61% during this period. It means the occupational distribution of the country has not been commensurated with the changing composition of the GDP. You see these figures I have repeated here. Is share of agriculture in GDP in 1970s was 41%, and 2020 it reduced to 16%. It means there was a 25 percentage decline in the share of agriculture in GDP. In as far as industry and manufacturing is concerned, you see that the share of this sector in GDP remains almost stable, rather marginally declined during this period from 26% to 25%. And services sector has shown a significant increase of 28 percentage point in their share in GDP, from 33% in 1970s to 61% in 2020. But corresponding to this, if you look at the share of these sectors in the workforce, agriculture, of course, the share of workforce has declined by 30 percentage point from 74 to 44. In case of industry and manufacturing, despite the fact that the share has remained almost stagnant, the share of industry and manufacturing in workforce has increased by 14 percentage point, indicating very clearly that this sector has the high employment elasticity. Means that if the sector expands, the more employment opportunities will be generated in the economy. If you look at the services sector, their share has increased in GDP by 28 percentage point, from 33% in 70s to 61% in 2020. But the contribution of service sector in generating the employment opportunities was not commensurate to its share in the GDP, meaning thereby that the the employment opportunities in this sector has increased only by 16 percentage points, and therefore the labor force or engaged in the service sector has increased only from 15% in 70s to 31% in 2020. And this indicates a kind of different kind of the structural change which has taken place in India's economy. As I mentioned in the beginning, that the the economist in the last century as well as in the current century has empirically tested this structural transformation which is taking place in economies once they start their journey of development, and they found a particular pattern of structural change has to occur in these economies, and India is observed to be an exception to this fact, an exception in the sense that the workforce which is released by the agriculture has been not fully absorbed by the industry and manufacturing at the first place, as highlighted by the various economists in the process of structural change. Rather, the workforce released by the agriculture has been absorbed largely in the services sector. In the services sector, but in even in the services sector, the increase in the workforce has not been commensurated with their share increase in the GDP, and this need an explanation as far as India's economy is concerned. And to understand this kind of system which has emerged in India, we have to look into the services sector in detail. And when we look at the services sector in detail, we find that the services sector has been bifurcated in two sectors. One is the organized services sector, which comprises of the modern services like the telecommunication services, the information technology services, information technology enabled services, or the financial services, that is banking services or insurance services. All these services are the modern services, and these services are essentially the more knowledge intensive and capital intensive, and therefore when these services expands, the share in GDP of service sector rises, but commensurate to that, the employment do not rise, because these services, as I said, are capital intensive and knowledge intensive, meaning that for expansion of these services, the huge capital investment is required and the huge demand for skilled workforce is created. But the workforce released by the agriculture is largely of either semi-skilled or unskilled type of workers. And if these workers, when they migrate to the non-agriculture areas, they do not find the employment opportunities commensurating their skills, and therefore, in search of the employment, they normally engage or they are absorbed in the unorganized service sector. Unorganized service sector is comprised of the small types of shops, restaurant, tourism, where the semi-skilled, unskilled workers are absorbed significantly, and therefore the service sector is basically uh, termed as a dual sector in India's economy. On the one hand, the organized service sector is expanding, which has the productivity of 8 to 10 times more than the productivity prevailing in the unorganized service sector. And therefore, the moment this organized service sector expands even marginally, the share of service sector in GDP rises. In the other sector, which is uh, normally termed as the informal service sector, the productivity is very low, and even if that expands, the share in the GDP do not increase commensurately, and that's why the service sector, of course, is showing the high share in GDP, but not showing the high growth of employment. High growth of employment. That this is the main reason of the this kind of the occupational structure we observed in case of India's economy. On the other hand, the industry and manufacturing sector, as I mentioned, is a very important sector and need to be expanded at the first stage. When the economy grows, the industry manufacturing sector expands and absorb the workforce released by the agriculture. But it has not happened in case of India, despite the fact that this sector has the high employment elasticity. The workforce released by the agriculture has not attracted towards industry and manufacturing. Rather, it has attracted towards the unorganized or informal service sector in India's economy. As a result, the industry and manufacturing sector, their share has increased in GDP, but their share has not increased commensurately as far as the employment opportunities are concerned. And moreover, in the industrial manufacturing sector, which we have opened up after 1991, has to compete with the rest of the world. And in the rest of the world, we observe that the demand for industrial and manufacturing goods were rising at the rate of 3 to 4% per annum, while the productivity in this sector was rising at the rate of 7 to 8% per annum. And therefore, there was already a excess capacity available in the industry and manufacturing sector. And when our industrial manufacturing sector have to compete with the world industrial manufacturing sector, they can't compete with reduction in prices. They can't change the prices. The only way to compete with the rest of the world is the reduction in the cost. And that's why the industrial manufacturing sector has become more and more capital intensive over a period of time to reduce the cost of production. As a result, the share of industrial manufacturing sector has increased or remained static in GDP, but they have not generated adequate employment opportunities as expected by the various economists who empirically tested the theory in other countries. And as a result, the industrial manufacturing sector remains almost static in the sense that its share in the GDP and its share in the employment workforce remains almost static in the recent years. But if you look at the agriculture has been the major source of livelihood in India right from the beginning. But in 1970s, the three-fourths of the workforce was employed in the agriculture, and agriculture was contributing around 40% in GDP. But after the new economic reforms introduced in the economy, the agriculture released the workforce to be employed in the non-farm sector, and the share of agriculture in GDP also started declining. And the decline in share of agriculture in GDP significantly declined from 41% in 70s to 16% in 2020. And it is around the same 16% even today. But corresponding to this decline, the share of workforce in agriculture has not declined. The workforce is still in agriculture is around 44%. 44% of our working population is still dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. And this is a cause of concern. It means that the 44% of the work population engaged in agriculture is producing only 16% of the GDP, which implicitly implies that the productivity of labor in agriculture sector is very, very low. 44% producing 16% of GDP, meaning that the productivity of factors of production, particularly of labor, is very low in agriculture. And therefore, the agriculture sector with low productivity, industry manufacturing sector with almost the static position, and services sector which expanded is only a minuscule sector, that is organized service sector. And organized service sector is constituting no more than 5% of the total service sector. It means the largest service sector in India is the informal type, and when the organized service sector expands, its share in the GDP rises. But as I said, the large portion of the service sector is informal, and therefore their productivity in the informal sector is low, despite the fact that they are having more than 90% share in the informal service sector as far as employment is concerned. But the 90% people are only contributing half of the service GDP, and 5% of the organized sector is contributing another half of the GDP. And this indicates a huge difference in the productivity of the workforce employed in the organized service sector and the workforce employed in the informal service sector. And this is the kind of situation has been observed in case of India's economy. And therefore, India's structural change has not been in consonance with the stylized pattern, a particular pattern which has been observed in other countries. And the reason I have explained, because of the static and stagnation position of the the industry and manufacturing sector. And you see that the as I said, that share of manufacturing sector has not been rising both in GDP as well as in employment. But if you particularly look at the structural change which has taken place after the economic reforms, that is after 1991, we have introduced the new economic policy in terms of in terms of the making the all sectors out of control of the government and making them dependent on the market forces. And you see that the structural change which are taking place in India is, of course, the changes are taking place, but changes are taking place in a very slower pace. You look at this table, this indicates the major changes which have taken place, particularly during the economic reforms regime. You see that in this table, the total workforce in India has been rising. In 1993, 94, there were 374 million people as workforce, which consistently increased uh, till 11-12. And after 11-12, the workforce has declined marginally, of course, marginally, but it has declined. It has declined, while the labor force is consistently rising, 381 in 93-94, and is consistently rising. Of course, in the last survey conducted by the Ministry of Labor, is almost stagnant. Labor force is stagnant. It means the labor force stagnation means the most of the people who are eligible for jobs, they may not be participating in the labor market and not seeking the job. They are outside the labor market. That's why the labor force is stagnant. But if you look at the agriculture, in agriculture, you look at till 2004-5, the share of agriculture in employment was continuously rising. It was only after 2004-5 the share of the workforce in agriculture started falling in absolute terms. In absolute terms, it started falling only after 2004-5. But if you look at that, the share which is the workforce which is released by the agriculture, where has it gone? You see that manufacturing in the later years, the share of manufacturing in the employment is not only static, but it declined in absolute terms, and it is still static at the same level. Of the figure is 15-16, but even today it is around 48-49 million people employed in the manufacturing. It means manufacturing is not absorbing the labor force which is released by the agriculture. Therefore, where has it gone? It has gone in the non-manufacturing and the services sector. You see that in non-manufacturing sector, it has increased from around 16 million to 57 million in 15-16. While in case of services, it has increased from 78 million to 141 million in this period. And in these two sectors, the informal sector has flourished in a big way, and the workforce which is released by the agriculture is largely absorbed in these two sectors, but largely is in the informal sectors, in the informal non-manufacturing and informal services sector. As a result, if you look at the last column, wherein we have, it is shown that the informal employment in the economy in 1999-2000, the NSSO survey indicated around 362 million people were employed in the informal sector, and their percentage has increased to around 439 million in 11-12. This is the figure from the NSSO survey. and the share of the informal employment in the total employment has increased from 19% in 1999-2000 to around 92.6% in 11-12, which basically proves the fact which I mentioned earlier, that the workforce released by the agriculture is largely absorbed in the informal sectors. Informal means informal non-manufacturing and informal services sector. And that's why you see that the unemployment rate, which was 1.9%, has only increased to 3.6% in 15-16 as per the NSSO. And this unemployment rate is not very high, meaning thereby that once the workers are released from agriculture, being very low productivity sector, to the non-farm sector, and because of the fact that they are either unskilled and semi-skilled, they are largely absorbed in the informal service sector or informal non-manufacturing sector in the non-farm sector. And therefore the informal employment is rising. This whole situation indicates one fact very clearly, that in India the problem is not of the employment generation. You see that unemployment rate has not been very significant. If you go by the usual status figure, unemployment rate is not very significant. Even today, if you go by PLFS figures, the unemployment rate is hardly 4.8% if we measure it in the form of the usual status of the workers. And even 5.8% or 5% is not a significant rate as far as the unemployment is concerned, meaning thereby that the problem in India is, apart from generating adequate employment opportunities, this other severe problem is the quality of employment. Quality of employment. It means employment opportunities are being generated in the India's economy, but they are largely generated in the informal sector. Informal sector, where the productivity is very low vis-a-vis the organized sector, and as a result, the most of the workforce is engaged in the low productivity areas or low productivity employment opportunities. And therefore, the focus of the policy makers should be not only on the employment generation, but also on improving the quality of employment in the India's economy. So therefore, this indicates that despite the fact that government has adopted the various policies for improving the manufacturing sector, we know that we have the Atmanirbhar Bharat. We also implemented Make in India scheme. We also implemented Skill India mission. We also implemented Startup India, Stand Up India. We have implemented the Digital India. We have implemented Smart Cities mission. We have implemented National Infrastructure Pipeline, is a scheme under which the infrastructure sector has been allocated huge funds for developing the various infrastructure projects. But despite all these facts, the share of the industrial manufacturing, both in GDP and the the workforce, is not rising. The share of industrial manufacturing in both in GDP and the workforce remains almost static, and therefore the focus area is this, and this is happening despite the fact that the manufacturing sector has the high employment elasticity vis-a-vis the agriculture and service sector, meaning thereby that if manufacturing output increases by 1 percentage point, the employment opportunities will be generated more in the manufacturing if the similar increase takes place in agriculture or services sector. Despite all this fact, the manufacturing sector is still remain stagnant or static as far as its contribution in GDP and the workforce is concerned. And here, this is the point where the policymaker has to focus upon. It means we have to have a national employment policy highlighting the major issues and the policy initiatives corresponding to them so that we can harness the potentials available in the India's economy. Today, of course, the structural change is taking place, but the pace of structural change is very, very slow. And therefore, if this structural change continues in the same pace, it may not be very, very sustainable in the long run. And therefore, we have to change the composition of the GDP as well as the composition of the occupational distribution or composition of the workforce engaged in various broad sectors. This has to be changed. And for that, the industry and manufacturing, especially manufacturing sector, has to has to show its expansion both in terms of its share in GDP and in terms of generating the employment opportunities. That's why all the policies, maybe that the SEZ policy, maybe earlier EPZ policy, now today the National Investment Manufacturing Zone policy, and the recently government has announced the National Infrastructure Pipeline, and the more recently the Production Linked Incentive Scheme announced by the government, just to motivate the manufacturing sector to enhance the level of output. And it is expected that if the level of output in manufacturing sector increases, it will generate the more employment opportunities, given the fact that the elasticity of employment in manufacturing sector is quite high. And therefore the whole focus of the government policies need to be on one, the expansion of the manufacturing sector, and two, the expansion of the organized services sector, and prepare the workforce which should be eligible in joining the services in the organized sector, meaning thereby we have to upgrade or enhance the skills of the people. Of course, they are educated up to school level or up to college level, but they do not possess the skills which are required in the market of the organized service sector or in the manufacturing sector. And therefore, skill orientation of our educated population is essentially required. Of course, for this purpose, government has announced in 2015 itself the Skill India mission. But the focus of that mission was to create the skill of the traditional type among the workforce. Now we have to change the focus of the Skill India mission, and the focus has to be on the Industrial Revolution 4.0, where the demand for the highly skilled workers in the IT or IT-enabled services and in financial services are required. And therefore, the focus of the government policies on creation of the skill should be on the area like artificial intelligence, big data, and in the financial services and insurance services or in stock market services. These are the very specialized services, and specialized skills are required by the people who want to join these services. And therefore, the only way through which we can slightly modify our structural change is only enhancing the skills of the people, educated people in the country, and the skill to be provided to them should match with the skills which is required in the market. Unless the skill possessed by the person match with the skills required in the market, this problem will not be solved. And therefore, the on account of the mismatch between the two, and people need employment for their survival, for their livelihood, they shifted to informal sector where the productivity is low, the wages and salaries are low, and therefore the share of informal sector in the GDP is low. This this change has to occur in India if we really want to improve the structural change, which is sustainable in the long run. Of course, we can lead on the path of development which is led by the services sector, but services sector should be should be able to expand the organized sector speedily, and for that we need a very highly skilled workers, and for which we have to take the very policy initiative by the government to match the increasing demand of skilled workers in the organized service sector, organized manufacturing sector. Only then we can slightly have a dent on the structural change in India's economy. And I hope that this brief demonstration class has given you the 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 relevant information as far as the the structural change in India is concerned, and we should be very well aware of the kind of structural change which is taking place in India's economy. These are some classes we are going to organize in the coming days. You may think of joining us and take the advantage of various experts who will be giving you the relevant information. Similarly, the Sriram IAS is offering the big offer to the students. That offer is available only up to 13th of May. You may hurry up and exploit this opportunity. With this, I end this class and thank you very much for giving the patient hearing to me. Thank you very much.